Thanks so much for joining us here on 9 News Plus. I'm Chris Bianchi, and today we're going to get into some of the legal woes facing the former President Donald Trump, starting, of course, with the Mar-a-Lago raid conducted by the FBI earlier on this month. But, of course, that's not the only legal issue that is facing the former president. There are a number of legal issues also facing him in Georgia, as well as in New York, as well as, of course, the ongoing investigations into the events of January the 6th. So for a bit more on that, we're now joined by 9 News legal expert Whitney Taylor for some insight. And I kind of very briefly summarize a lot of those things I just mentioned. But Whitney, can you give us a bit more of a succinct and a detailed summary about what is facing the former president at this point?
Yeah, and there's a number of matters that are facing him, both civil and criminal. And I think I would probably say there's 5. There's in Manhattan, in New York, there's both a civil and criminal investigation, 2 separate investigations going on. And those are both dealing with various business dealings. And a lot of companies do this, where it's not proper, but when they're trying to get a loan, they'll inflate things and make their numbers look good, but when it comes time to taxes, they try and make the numbers look low. And so it's those kind of sort of manipulation of the numbers that are both in the civil and criminal case. There's also the Georgia case, in which there's the election fraud issues. That's being prosecuted by Fulton County District Attorney Fani Willis, who I went to law school with. She's a classmate of mine. Very good attorney, very tenacious. That would be interesting if she ends up prosecuting. And they have already impaneled the grand jury, and they've started to actually have testimony. So,
and by the way, to be clear, that's when Donald Trump, I believe, called the Secretary of State of Georgia and said, "Find me," I believe it was 12,000 votes. Find the votes, right? That's
that conversation with the Secretary of State when he suggested, yes, finding votes. And it's that conduct and others around that is being investigated. And then, of course, the January 6th committee is looking into things. They can't prosecute, but they can make recommendations. And, of course, people are testifying under oath, so that can always be, used in any of these proceedings. And then, of course, the final FBI raid, which you mentioned we recently saw, that was into documents that were taken related to, as it's been reported by the Washington Post, certain nuclear information, and whether this classified information was proper. And so they're actually potentially looking at the Espionage Act with regard to what happened there. And you have to remember, though, everybody's just in investigation stage, so no charges have been brought, and we do have a presumption of innocence in the country. But I can say that Merrick Garland, he's completely thorough. If he authorized, which he said he did, this warrant for Mar-a-Lago, you have to believe that there is a sufficient amount of evidence. He just has a reputation of being extremely thorough.
With that said, and kind of want to reemphasize that we're looking at this strictly from a legal perspective, no political implications here, but with that said, which of those cases that you outlined do you think at this point here in late August of 2022 has the highest potential for conviction?
Well, it's a good question, and I really have to look at the New York. I really look at the New York and the Georgia cases. The election fraud, I think there's some real exposure there in Georgia. But with regard to the New York matter, first, so New York has this, when you plead the Fifth in a civil matter, the jury can then take an adverse inference, meaning they can assume you took the Fifth for a negative reason, not in a criminal charge. That's one of the beautiful things about the Fifth Amendment, is that it can't be used against you in a criminal charge. But New York has this unique situation in the civil claim. And so we know that Allen Weisselberg, Eric Trump, and Donald Trump all pled the Fifth in hundreds of times throughout their depositions. So that may come back to haunt them. But from the reporting, it sounds like there is a sufficient amount of evidence regarding their business dealings, which will be the civil and criminal cases in New York. I think those are probably the most exposure.
Now, when it comes to the FBI raid, the high-profile, what turned out to be a high-profile FBI raid, I think the FBI, based on reporting, it seemed like they wanted it to be a lower-key event. What sorts of repercussions could be facing the former president here? We don't know everything, obviously. We don't know exactly the types of documents, but based on what you know, what sorts of repercussions are facing the president there?
Right. So depending on what he's charged with, if anything at all, there could be civil and criminal charges. And there's never been criminal charges against a former president. So this is completely unprecedented and uncharted waters. And in President Trump's defense, their argument is we were working with the FBI all along. They had come at various times. We weren't necessarily withholding things. The raid wasn't necessary. The raid was politically motivated to create the optic. But on the other hand, others are saying, no, these were documents that, whether they were classified or top secret or whatever, they were not being properly maintained. They shouldn't have been taken from the White House, is the allegation. So it's serious allegations, but certainly the President Trump has defenses.
And you mentioned that Merrick Garland has a reputation for being thorough, and he said in his confirmation hearings that he's a by the book, by the law kind of guy. Reading into it, and again, this is just me, not a lawyer, and asking a lawyer for legal insight on this, you would think that these sorts of documents, or that if there was full cooperation, the FBI would not have gone to the extent, correct?
You can. That's a safe assumption. Yes. Yeah,
it's an implication, obviously.
Correct, and it's there's a lot of speculation around this, and this is the issue around investigations, right? Sometimes in the workplace they won't tell people exactly what they're investigating, but they're asking a broad range of questions, or even a narrow set of questions, and people are left wondering. And so that's the same thing here, but the implication, or the based on Merrick Garland's reputation, he's not going to go in there. And certainly, I would assume any attorney general is going to be careful going after a former president and actually having a raid, knowing the kickback that there's going to be. So it's also interesting that he had requested that the warrant be made public. I think that is very telling. Merrick Garland had a press conference and he requested that it be made public, because I believe the nature of what they were looking for was so serious and so egregious that it would be, I think, probably good for public, public sentiment, if you will, to see here's what we're actually looking for.
There is some public polling that indicates that about 55 to 60% of the public approves of some of the raids and the ongoing investigations that have been going into the former president. With that in mind, I think it's worth noting that the former president, that Donald Trump, has a reputation for perhaps getting up to the line where the law can stand. He has a reputation of being Teflon Don in terms of perhaps dodging some of these legal woes. Do you see that in these cases? Do you see him perhaps skirting prosecution, conviction in some of these cases? No,
I think that the definition and the reputation actually fits. I will say, has he been persecuted since he was president, and after? Are people after him for political reasons? Of course, yes. I mean, we have to acknowledge that, the same way they were after President Obama, and still try. The difference is there just weren't any criminal charges or scandals or anything of that nature. But the point is, if they're coming after the president like that, some people would say, well, of course it's politically motivated, but here there is a substantial amount of evidence. And what I used to tell my students, one of the benefits of President Trump being in office is he really did help us to flush out our democracy. He pushed the boundaries on so many different things in terms of what a president can do. And this goes back to the founding, and this was one of the points of the Constitution, was to have a check and balance, to have three separate branches of government that could check one another. And President Trump, when he was in office, completely challenged that, and we actually got some parameters around our democracy and how it should work. So here, it's sort of the same thing. Now we're having all of these new issues that are legitimate issues, and what his style is, both reputational and the way that he handles these lawsuits, is, you have the whole Trump organization and Trump name to deal with, and a lot of times it is not a fair fight. I mean, I do believe in our system and our justice system works, but when you have an army of lawyers, when you have these amount of resources, you can delay things, you can make it cost money, you can just pound the other side into the ground. And having the executive privilege along with that, somebody with that sentiment, sort of a bulldog, if you will, doesn't necessarily move with grace, just kind of rolls over. And that's, I think, what has historically happened. But now, at some point, the bell will toll in terms of having your day in court. And I believe in the system, so there will be evidence. There will be either a jury or a judge making these decisions, both on the civil and criminal, if criminal charges are brought. And it will be, it will be played out. The system does work, though, so we will eventually see how these finalize in court.
Well, you think that the system works. The problem, perhaps, that we may be seeing now is that there is decaying trust in a lot of public institutions, but I think the judiciary in particular in the last few months has faced a lot of that questioning that's gone around it with this FBI raid in mind, whether or not you see it as an accurate thing or as a correct thing. How is faith in the judiciary and Supreme Court all the way down to local judges, how is it restored?
That's an excellent point, and that is a huge concern. Right now, I mean, the things that have happened in the past 5 to 6 years are a decaying trust in the judiciary and, of course, questions about our election integrity. And honestly, that the judiciary and folks losing faith in the judicial branch personally is probably my biggest concern as our society, because the judges are the arbiters. They're the ones who decide. We're going to have disputes, we're going to have partisanship, we're going to be polarized at times, but if you don't trust the body that is there to decide these issues, to ultimately rule one way or another, if you stop trusting that, then we do lose our rule of law and order. I mean, there's nobody who's going to, ultimately make this decision. So that's really concerning, and I do know I'm encouraged because there's a lot of bipartisan groups working on this issue, restoring faith in the judiciary. And I'll tell you, one of the biggest issues, we have to look at our confirmation hearings, because now they've become completely partisan, and that's the sort of most visible spectacle that we have of the judiciary. Most people, when they watch that, and all they see is infighting, and then everybody just goes down party lines. And you have to look at Scalia and Ginsburg and some of these very far liberal or conservative justices that were confirmed almost unanimously. And now it just goes completely down party lines. So that is something we have to evaluate and do something about, because I think the confirmation hearings are actually chipping away at the public trust in the judiciary more than anything else.
Hard to have a football game, hard to have a soccer game if you don't trust the referee, and that's perhaps the issue at play. But Whitney Taylor, you are our referee here, so thanks so much for joining us here on 90s Plus and giving us some insight on all these issues facing the former president.
For sure, it's always good to be here, and I'm happy to be back anytime.
Thanks so much.
All right.